And please don't adjust your radio. I know you're used to hearing the glorious voice of Jane Nielsen, our executive director, but she took some time off and allowed me to bring in a couple of, I would call them my mentors for years in the National Federation of the Blind, people that I greatly admire. Last week you heard our interview with Barbara Loos, and because it's Meet the Blind Month all through the month of October, I wanted to speak with her husband, Brad Loos, who is with us now. Brad, welcome to Community Conversations.
Hello, Ryan.
Brad has quite the interesting story, and Barbara, we heard a lot about her and her struggle against adversity last week, and Brad has quite a different, yet in some ways similar story. So, Brad, what Jane Nielsen always tells our listeners is that we are guests in their living rooms and their homes. So we want them to feel as if they know the person we're speaking to. To that end, tell us about yourself, about your background, and how you came to be here today.
I was born here in Lincoln, 1954. I graduated from Lincoln High School in 1973. My parents were divorced when I was very young. I was the oldest of four. I have a younger brother and two younger sisters. Sadly, I have outlived both of my younger sisters. As Barbara mentioned to you, I was married. Mary Jo was her name. She had a disease called lupus that caused her blindness, but had been in remission for many years. But when we got married, and we were expecting a child, and we were both very happy about that. We'd always wanted kids, but her lupus came back again during that time period and caused that child to be born dead. And it took her life a few months later. Both of those things happened in 1981. But I was blinded. I went in the Navy right out of high school in 1973, and I spent the winter of 73 in Chicago getting some brain training stuff up there, and then I spent 3 years on the USS Manly, DD-940. We were doing some gunnery exercises out of Guantanamo Bay in 1977, March 16th, 1977, and we were having a problem with the mount. It was malfunctioning, and there was a lieutenant in there and two other men. I was a senior enlisted man. The lieutenant and I were trying to fix the problem, but it blew up in our face. This caused me to be set on fire and give me some shrapnel wounds, including one that penetrated my forehead, which is why my forehead is made out of plastic today. When I was having difficulty breathing because of burns, Navy corpsman, and a corpsman is someone about the level of a paramedic, did an emergency tracheotomy, cut my throat so I could breathe through my neck. I ended up getting spinal meningitis and hepatitis and pneumonia and a collapsed lung and stuff like that. That was how I was blinded. In the beginning, when my mother first got to the hospital, she said she did not recognize me by my face. She said I looked like some kind of a monster out of a horror movie. My brother recognized me, though. He said, "Those are my brother's feet, I can tell." So that was the first time when they said that the end was near, and so people should say their final goodbyes and do all that stuff. And so they did come in and say their final goodbyes and waited for the end to come. But that was over 42 years ago, and those of us who are still alive are still waiting for that to happen. So that was how I was blinded. I went briefly to Hines, which is the training center for veterans in Chicago. But my mother found out that there was a training center in Lincoln, which is where my family was, and she said, "What's he doing up there when he could be here?" So she called up there and talked to John Malmasian, the director, and said, "Why can't he be here?" He said, "It's got to be a veteran's place." My mother, being my mother, called a congressman, Charles Stone at the time, said, "I don't see why he can't be here." The congressman didn't see why I couldn't be there either, so he called John Malmasian, and in no time I'm heading back to Nebraska. So I go to take a tour of the training center, and that's where I first met Barbara and her first husband, Jim, who both worked there. That's also where I first met the woman who would become my first wife.
Let me take you back for just a moment. This is a memory you've lived with ever since it happened to you, but for many people listening, this is the first they're hearing of the experience, and they will never experience anything remotely close to it. Tell me as much as you can remember about the details of the day that the gun accident occurred and that you were blinded.
I have no memory of the gun actually exploding. We were working on the thing, and the next thing I remember, somebody was dragging me out of the gun mount. But I've talked to people who were there that day when all of that happened to get some of their memory. And, when something like that explodes, it creates a shock wave. What is a shock wave? That's a force of pressure that goes out. And this shock wave was so potent it blew a steel hatch off its hinges, and there was a big fireball in it. That fireball went past me before it blew the steel hatch off, but it doesn't go on the outside of you, it goes on the inside of you. It goes down your nose and up your throat and into your lungs, and it rattles your cage in a really intensive kind of way. I remember being pulled out of the gun mount. And when you go to the emergency room, how people say, what's your pain level, a 1 or a 10 or whatever, and 10 being the worst and so on. I said, here's what a 10-day is. A 10-day is when the pain is so total and so all-consuming, there's nothing else in your life but that. You don't know nothing else. You don't know where you're at. You don't know who's around. You don't know if you got all your limbs or not. It's like your brain is submerged in a sea of ripping, screaming, tearing pain, and there's nothing else in your life but that. That's a 10. But that's when the out-of-body kind of thing came. Was after that, and I'm standing here looking at myself. And on a ship like the one I was on, there's no place even for a helicopter to land. What you do in a case like mine is they put you in a kind of a wire body-shaped stretcher, and they put straps across you, and they attach it to the underside of the helicopter, and that's how you leave the ship, is hanging underneath it. But I was standing there looking at, the helicopter's there. I could see myself in this stretcher, and the helicopter hovering overhead, and I could see the shadow of the helicopter on the deck. And that was a very brief experience, but during that time period, it was, I didn't think anything, I didn't feel nothing, either emotional or physical. It was as unresponsive as a camera. But I'm just standing there looking at myself. Because I was 100% focused on myself, though I wasn't looking around or nothing and thinking, oh, there's Bill over there. There's nothing like that. I was just looking at myself in this stretcher. But now I'm back in myself, and I'm in this stretcher. And at that point, I actually felt very pleasant. I felt very calm. I didn't feel any pain. I felt very relaxed, almost like I'd been taken. I felt almost kind of a euphoric drug high, kind of just dreamy. I was recording stuff, like I felt a pillow under my head, and I felt the straps going across my chest and shoulders, and the ones across my legs, and I could. The rotors were making a cool breeze on my face, which felt very pleasant. And I felt very relaxed, and I felt very drowsy, and I just, I'm recording all this, but I'm not thinking anything about it. I'm not thinking what's going on or where I'm not thinking anything. I'm just taking all this in. And, if you think of yourself laying out in a hammock in the backyard, and there's a cool breeze, and you feel pleasant, you think, yeah, boy, I'd like just out and take a little nap. It's very pleasant out here. But I heard the rotors power up, and I felt myself start being lifted off the deck, and at that point, I go through a period where I have no conscious memory of anything. I remember being in Bethesda Naval Hospital and going through the, family being around and physical therapy and occupational therapy. In the beginning, the nurses would move my joints for me, rub my legs and bend my knees and do all that stuff. The physical therapist who got me walking again, I think of her as the sergeant. I can't remember her name, but she was intense. She cut me no slack. She drove me mercilessly. She got me out of bed. She got me moving. She would drive me and say, you will, dude, get up. You need to move, and so on. But everything was so hard. Even the slightest things caused me to be totally exhausted. Everything hurts. Everything's so difficult. So, besides recovering from the head injury, they'd done surgery on my brain, picking shrapnel out of the front of my brain. Everything was so hard. Everything was so hard.
What would you say the most difficult thing about your recovery was?
Oh, boy, the head injury was the big thing. Blindness was the least of my problems in the beginning. I've read a number of stuff about head injuries and stuff since that time, TBIs and stuff like that, and they said one of the things that happens for some people, but not everybody, is that sometimes what happens is what they call rewiring of the brain in things I've read, where they talked about how if you have damage to your brain, that damaged part may be damaged forever, but what happens sometimes is the brain, in rewiring itself, you eventually get to a point where the brain still does the same stuff it used to, but you're using a different part of your brain now. And I think that did happen for me, but of course it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time for everything, the burns to heal, for shrapnel wounds to heal, for all that stuff. All that stuff takes time to do. And in the meantime, just recovering my physical strength. With something like that, you don't just wake up like you're waking up from a nap. It begins with just a dim awareness that you exist somewhere in the universe. And then you sort of gradually move out from there. You begin to become, somebody's touching me, I hear somebody's voice, stuff like that. And for a time it seemed like there was a filter between me and the rest of the world. See, I was on one side and everybody else was on the other. People could reach through that filter and touch me. But they weren't in the same dimension that I was in. You can be blown to hell in a microsecond, but it's a long, hard road back if you don't stay there. It takes a lot of intensive work and a lot of, continuing to do stuff over and over again and trying to figure it out. And eventually you get there. When I went through the center in Nebraska for a couple of months, but then I had to leave there, and I went home for a while because, frankly, I just hadn't healed enough. I just hadn't recovered enough to really be able to keep doing that. So I went home for a while, and mostly I just slept for quite a while. I did finally start back. In 1978, I got involved in the National Federation of the Blind myself. I joined in 1982. I went to my first national and state convention in 1983. I also came to know Dr. Jernigan. I didn't know him as well as Barbara did, but I did come to know him and have some experience with. I went to a leadership seminar and had some other experiences to help me to get to know him a little better. I did go, when he died in 1998 of cancer, Barbara and I and a couple other people did go to his memorial in Baltimore. Throughout the 80s and stuff, I was very much involved in the National Federation of the Blind. My brother and I started a business, home and construction business, but it wasn't very successful. It cost me more money than I ever made from it, but it was one of the ventures I've done along the road. I've had a couple of pretty significant relationships. One woman I was married to, one woman I was not, but my kids come from my second wife, Kyra and Ben and Emma. But when I got a divorce from my second wife in 2000, one of the things that I said was, really something has to be different here. I can't just keep living this way. This is miserable for everybody. And I really worked hard on changing how I thought, how I lived, what I did, or how I did it. And when Barbara and I got married, about 3.5 years later, we didn't rush into nothing. I really worked hard on devoting myself to this woman, to this marriage, being committed to her, and we, as Barbara mentioned in her interview, have been very successful at this. Come December 27th, it'll be 16 years. It's a very loving marriage. And we're very good to each other. In that time, Barbara had her cancer, I had mine. During that time, a tumor caused me to get a ruptured stomach. I actually lost more blood than my body holds. Fortunately, they'd plugged me in and was pumping more into me while it was squirting out in all directions, and lots of it. I had a nurse up by my head, Jen. She'd keep wiping blood off my face and saying, "Hang in there, stay with me. You can do the cheerleaders are nice."
Sure.
So that was when Barbara, in her interview, said, the doctor said to her it would be more merciful if you just let him go. Because even if he lives, his brain won't work and his kidneys won't work, blood loss and oxygen deprivation. That was her opportunity to get rid of me, but she hung on to me. And she said, really, we ain't doing that letting go thing. So 10 years ago, the ruptured stomach happened in January of 2009. And in August, 10 years ago this month, it finally went into remission. They said, you're done with this. And so I went home.
Going back to the NFB for just a moment, what drew you to that organization? There's quite a number of organizations that are available.
Two really significant events that happened within the first year or so of my being blinded. One of them was when I was in Hines, the only time they would let you use a cane is during cane travel class, because they said they didn't want you to develop bad habits. When I went to the center in Nebraska, on the very first day I went there, they handed me a long white cane and said, take this with you everywhere and never go anywhere without it. And I thought, this is so marvelous, this is so wonderful. You can actually reach out and see, there's stairs, there's chairs. I don't have to run into stuff. I don't have to fall down the stairs. I don't have to shuffle my feet and wave my hands in front of my face. What a bunch of nonsense. I thought that was wonderful, and I took their advice, and from that day to this, I never go anywhere without a long white cane. The only place I don't use it is inside my own house. But even if I go out in the yard, I take it with me. And even inside the house, if we're having social function with people moving around and stuff, I still use it to keep me from, running into people and stepping on people and so on. That was one thing. The other thing is that within the first year, I met Barbara, her first husband, Jim Walker, who was a good friend of mine. I like Jim. He was a good guy. And Fred Schroeder. Those three people, meeting those three people, not only those three people, but around that time period, because all three of those people had very different personalities, very different approaches to life as a blind person. But all three of them were adult people. They had a life. They had careers, and they would travel, and they were doing stuff. Jim Walker was the guy who actually showed me how to cook. Blind people cook out on the grill. Oh yeah, get the fire. This is how I get the fire going, and this is what I do. He loved cooking out, and he'd always be out there, and it didn't matter if it was raining or snowing. He's out there cooking on the grill. And so he's the one. He also showed me how a blind person can mow their own lawn. He was one of the guys who showed me that. And Fred and I were young guys at the time we met. We were around our our mid-20s or so, and we were young guys and going out and doing young guy stuff, but I mean, we actually were having a life and doing stuff. Life still existed. So meeting these three people around the same time was actually had a very powerful effect on me as a newly blind person. Wow, life isn't really over. There still is life out there. And of course, I've been married and raised kids, and I've done different kinds of jobs over the years. And my wife and I travel quite a bit. And, look, nobody would choose to be blind, and I wouldn't either. Having 20/20 eyesight, that'd be nice. On the other hand, what I tell people is, if I was making out a list of ideal physical characteristics, I wouldn't mind being taller. I'm about 5'8", and I wouldn't mind having more hair. I'm bald on top. That'd be nice. But, I mean, we got to take what we got and do what we can do with it. And that's where we need to go. And this is what I got from from Barbara and Jim and Fred and a woman named Rosemary Lerdahl, who was an employee of the agency at the time. And people had talked to me about, well, why don't you join the Federation? I said, well, I didn't really feel like joining the organization. But finally in 1982, Rosemary said, of course, this is about a year or so after my first wife had died, and she said, well, I'm going to a meeting. Why don't you come with me? And so I said, well, okay. So I did. But anyway, so I go to a meeting, and I joined in November of '82. I guess I was just ready to be due. I was looking for something after Mary Jo died, and I guess that was it. So, what my message would be to everybody out there. Okay, I've twice been on that bridge, that void in between this world and the next. When everybody said it's over for this guy, stick a fork on him, put him on a plate, he's done. And twice that didn't happen. I've had pneumonia 4 times in my life. Just recently, earlier this year. I think one of the reasons why I'm still alive, still here, and while life is still working for me is because, quite frankly, I've hung on tighter and fought back harder. To not only hang on to my life in the first place against all the odds, but I've also fought hard to make my life something that's worth having, worth doing. This isn't easy. It's hard. And sometimes you try and you fail and try and fail, and you try and fail, and then you find something that works for you. And I've made some huge mistakes in my life, and I've done some really dumb things, and I've even engaged in some sinful behavior now and then. But But the thing is, I can't go back and I can't do the rewind. I can't go back and do it over and fix whatever it is I did wrong. But what I can do, and what I believe I have done, is I can say, okay, I can learn something from that and do something better as I go forward. And why do we hang on through these times when things are so horrifying, like the 10-day and stuff like that? And because for days like this, when we're sitting here talking, and days like this when I am with my wife and she's sitting on the couch and snuggled up to me and we're listening to a little quiet music, or we're hanging out with the family or whatever we're doing, we hang on for these kinds of days, see, the good stuff.
Speaking of family, tell me about your kids.
Kyra, Barbara and I had this parallel situation. Garth came from Jim's first wife before Barbara, and that's where he came from. And then Marcia and John was from Barbara and Jim. Kyra came from my second wife, Sheila, who she was married to somebody before me, and that's where Kyra comes from. And then Ben and Emma came along from Sheila and I. Kyra and Marcia are only about 6 months apart. Ben and Emma are a few years younger. But Kyra, ever since I came into her life when she was about 7 or 8, has always called me Dad. And even though her mom and I have been divorced now for 19 years, she still calls me Dad. She has 2 kids, Aiden and Hannah. Ben is married with no children. Emma just got married last year. Emma, right before she got married, she gave me a bandana which she had embroidered on herself in Braille. "I never forget you loved me first."
Ben kind of followed in your footsteps.
Ben spent 8 years in the Navy. He's currently where he went in right out of high school, like I did. 5 years of that was on an aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, aviation ordnance. That was weapons on aircraft. And now he's working for Tyson Foods in the management position, in corporate management. So that's what he's doing now. The difference is between myself and Ben, as I mentioned, I'm about 5'8", he's about 6'4". I looked at one of his sweatshirts one day and I thought, boy, if I put a vertical pole up in here, I could climb in there with a sleeping bag and just pretend.
And what's Emma doing now?
Emma, when she graduated from high school, she said, "I want to be a chef," which was surprising to me, but hey, she's got a plan. So she goes through culinary art school, and she does some other stuff, and ultimately she actually has been gainfully employed as a chef. She manages a single barrel down there, but one of the chef, if you're called Chef Emma or Chef Ryan or whatever, that's like being called professor, or like being called captain or something. It actually is a title to which you earn. You don't get called Chef Emma unless you've done something to earn that title, in the same way you don't get called professor unless you've earned it. So she's Chef Emma, managing the single barrel restaurant on 10th and P in Lincoln, and doing some teaching out of Southeast Community College, and that's what she's doing.
Well, Brad, as I said to your wife, the clock is our master, but before we close out this interview, I want to ask you the same 2 final questions I asked her. Going back to the blindness issue for a moment, given that it is Meet the Blind Month, what do you think the greatest accomplishment of the blind has been in your lifetime?
I think technology has opened a lot of doors for blind people that heretofore were closed. I say that saying that I'm not really a technology guy. Technology baffles me. My wife keeps trying to explain it to me, and she has to keep explaining it to me. But I do think technology has opened a lot of doors that were closed to blind people before. And I also think that it has to do with people like Kenneth Jernigan and Mark Maurer, who succeeded Kenneth Jernigan as president of the National Federation of Blind, and people like them, not just them, but a lot of the foot soldiers too, people like Barbara, who've been at this for years and years, and just the people who get out there. When I was growing up, around Lincoln, I don't remember ever seeing. I saw one blind person get on the bus with a cane back in the '60s, but I don't remember ever seeing anybody walking around with white canes or dogs. But now we are everywhere. That's a big change. And I think it has to do with the kinds of people like, for example, James Nyman. I never was employed by him like Barbara was. I did go through the center when he was the director there, and I did come to know him personally. But I do think it's people like that, and I think technology are the things that are really driving and developing those kinds of attitudes with people like Barbara and Jim Walker and people like that who are helping to develop the attitudes in young blind people and inspiring people like me.
You've talked about the greatest accomplishments. What one challenge do you think we still have as blind people that we need to overcome?
The challenges that we have as blind people, and the biggest problem we have is ourselves. And by that I mean we talk about those people out there, the sighted people with their bad attitudes and what they do, and that's certainly out there. But we contribute to that because whether you grow up as a sighted person or whether you grow up as a blind person, we all grow up with the same general attitudes about blindness. What it is, what it ain't, what it causes. We get into what I call double think. What's double think? Double think means that if you have a sighted person who slips and falls down on some ice, somebody says, well, that could happen to anybody. If I slip and fall down on the ice, we get people saying, oh, that's because you're blind. If only you could see, you would have seen that ice and that kind of stuff. That's what I call double think. But we have this kind of problem that we ourselves have to get the attitude and go forward. So I think the biggest challenge isn't even those people out there, although that is a part of the challenge. The bigger one is how we gain the right kind of attitudes ourselves to go out and do what I told my kids to do. You want a place? You got to go out and make it. If you don't, you either won't have a place or it'll be someone else that is chosen for you. It won't be your place.
Well, Brad, it has been a fascinating discussion, and we want to thank you for coming and sharing your story with us here on Community Conversation in celebration of Meet the Blind Month. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been Community Conversations. Our thanks to Brad Loos for our interview today. And please stay tuned for our next program. Have a great day, my friends, and please keep tuned. Bye-bye.